of Science by the University of Trihunu, Sri Lanka in 2004. Currently, he is an honorary professor at the University of Buckingham, UK, and also at the University of Trihunu, Sri Lanka, and Sir John Kotalawala Defence University, Sri Lanka, and an adjunct professor at the National Institute of Fundamental Studies in Sri Lanka. He is an award-winning poet and the author or co-author of over 30 books and over 350 scientific papers. Recent books include Cosmic Genetic Evolution, Diseases from Outer Space, A Journey with Fred Hoyle, The Search for Our Cosmic Ancestry, Where did we come from, and Our Cosmic Ancestry in the Stars. In addition to giving many endowed lectures at universities worldwide, he was the John Snow Memorial Lecturer and John Snow Medalist of the Association of Anaesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland in 2004. In 2005, he was named in the first annual Asian Powers 100, a list of the most influential Asians living in the UK. Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe follows the Buddha's teaching, and during his childhood, he had learned Buddhism from Venerable Narada Thera at Vajrarama in Bambalapitiya, Colombo. His parents were devout Buddhists and devoted diekas of Vajrarama. He had given several lectures at the London Buddhist Vihara. Today he is going to talk on Buddhism, cosmic life, and future prospects for humanity. Please do join us for what will be a very interesting and enlightening talk. With my gratitude to Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, I would like to invite you to deliver your talk, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venerable Sila Vimala. My first duty is to thank you for inviting me to this important occasion. I would much rather have had the opportunity of addressing you all in person, to see you in real life. But as it turned out, this has been impossible for a variety of reasons. So we are having this Zoom lecture, which I sometimes do, but I don't always enjoy it as much as seeing my audience and getting their reactions in real time. Anyway, this is the topic of my lecture: Buddhism, Cosmic Life, and Future Prospects for Humanity. I have trouble sharing, changing my slides. I don't know. Post a spotlight your video for everyone got it.
We can see the slides, Professor.
How can I change it though? I have to change the slides, and there's no icon that comes on the screen to change the slides. And when
Can you try enter or your arrow keys to move to the next one, please?
Arrow key to move to the next one. Where would that be? Now Okay, right. Now we are in business. Okay, so this is a lecture that is dedicated to in honor of Anuragi Dharmapala. And there's no doubt that he played a major role in transmitting the timeless message of Buddhism across the world. He was unquestionably a great scholar, a pious monk, and of course the founder of our London Buddhist Vihari. In other religions, such individuals would have been deemed to be saints, but we have no such opportunities. Ana Garika Dharmapala would in the present day be what Asoka the Great was in the 3rd century BC, in his efforts at essentially proselytizing our religion and contributing it to be the main world religion, a major world religion that it is today. My life in science for over 4 decades gave me more and more confidence in the relevance of Buddhism and the Buddhist worldview. Venerable Sila Vimala already told you that I grew up in a Buddhist family. My parents were Buddhists, and we often had visited the Vajrayana temple and had dialogues with the chief monk there, the Venerable Narada. However, I owe my early interest in astronomy to the night skies of Sri Lanka, which in the 1950s were really brilliant. There were no street lights, no pollution, and so the situation that I watched in every night after night was a glorious Milky Way stretching from horizon to across this whole sky. This picture that I've got on my slide is, I haven't actually been to Yala, but it is a photograph of the night sky in the Yala National Park. Well, inspired by such amazing sights, I wrote a poem in 1956 that foreshadowed my later career in science in a rather remarkable way. So this is the haiku. I used to write poems in the haiku style, and I said the following: among a myriad stars, I stand alone and wonder how much life and love there was to. These are the definite facts that we learn from an early age, the facts that I'm going to list below now. Firstly, the Earth, our home, is an ordinary planet. Nothing very special about it. It's one planet that orbits our sun in the solar system. Our sun, the sun in our solar system, is one of 100 billion stars that will look very similar to the sun if you go close to them. And these stars, 100 billions of stars, make up the Milky Way galaxy that we see edge on, as we did in the first slide, against the backdrop of Yala National Park. And our Milky Way galaxy is only one of billions of stars in the late cosmos. Giving you the view of life, that human, that's you and I and all of creatures who look like us, right at the top on other life forms, humbler life forms, are just superior and supreme. That's the current view. And then I think more disastrous in my reckoning is an assumption that has gone right through science for hundreds of years in the West, that human life is unique to our planet. Not only human life, that life itself is unique to our planet. This point of view is a cultural norm, and it controls how we behave towards each other, how we think about the world around us. The result of this worldview, the prevailing worldview, is that we are riddled with conflict and disharmony. We live in a world that is threatened with climate change, with wars, and eventually with the denudation, this complete destruction of resources that support life on a very short time scale. Buddhism seeks to understand the human condition in a much more humble way. It seeks to connect human life on equal terms with all other life that exists throughout the vast universe. It is in this sense that my own scientific career began to run very closely with the tenets of Buddhism. And many other luminaries in science, I'm not alone in this belief, of course, many other luminaries in science, notably Albert Einstein, the preeminent physicist of the 20th century, said if there is a religion that can cope with modern science, it would be Buddhism. It is an amazing and humbling thought to reflect on the fact that Buddhism really anticipated the modern worldview as long ago as 1500 years before Europe at the time of the Copernican revolution. In the Anagutara Nikaya, which was apparently translated in Sri Lanka around the 1st century BC, it is said that as far as the suns and moons revolve, shedding their light in space, so far extends the world system of thousands of heavenly bodies. This is called a thousandfold minor world system. And then it goes on to define not just one world system, but a whole hierarchy of world systems, referring to this entire universe as this sphere of 1,000,000,000 world systems. And this, you must remember, was 1,500 years before Copernicus ever thought of making the Earth a minor planet around the sun. Let me next trace our own, our meaning human, biological ancestry as modern science informs us. This is a more modern scientific view that has emerged over the past few years. The last stages of our human form of these hominid ancestors who roamed the earth for thousands of years. The first hominids lived in Eastern Africa, perhaps for 5 to 7 million years ago. And the oldest evidence for modern man, Homo sapiens, and skeletons have only recently been discovered in these caves in Morocco, they date back only to 1,000 billion, only to 300 million years. And that's in relation to the age of the Earth, which is 4.5 billion years. We have existed as humans just for the blink of an eye, a really very minute speck of time. The first modern man, modern humans, like you and me, walked out of Africa as hunter-gatherers something like 70,000 years ago. And this is a picture of, a schematic picture of hunter-gatherers walking across the fields. And then they began to cultivate the land. And about 10,000 years ago, our hunter-gatherer ancestors began to get essentially civilized. They began to live in groups, in cities, to grow crops. And the first cities and civilizations began in two distinct parts of the world, one in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, and the other in the Indus Valley. The first on the left-hand side is the Babylonian city, or the remains of the Babylonian city of Ur, which is 5,500 years ago. And on the right is the Indus Valley city of Mohenjo-daro, which is roughly the same time, perhaps a little younger, 5,000 years ago. So that was the situation that we inherited from the very earliest times. And when we, human ancestors that is, began to live in conurbations, in cities, they grew crops, they didn't have to hunt and spend all their time looking for food. And they had then time to ponder, to think about the deepest matters that related to their own existence. Questions like, what is life? They began to ask such questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here for? Are we alone in the universe? So these are very, very ancient questions, very primitive questions that would have been asked tens of thousands of years ago by our ancestors who were living in these ancient cities. And then as a result of asking these deep philosophical questions, we find the beginnings of religions, where in the first instance we find the proposition of gods being everywhere, gods in the sea, gods in the clouds, gods in the underworld. It is, I think, when ancient humans first thought of the sun god, first invented the sun god, that our links to all life in the universe began. It is when we began to turn inwards to the earth at the center and as being the center of the world, and to say that humans were the purpose of creation, that things began to go very badly wrong, scientifically as well as morally. It is an amazing coincidence, an accident of history, that three of the greatest philosophers of all time appear on this planet at almost the same time in widely separated parts of the world. And all three individuals stress the importance of discussion, of dialogue, in coming to grips with understanding problems connected with our existence. So we have Socrates in the 5th century BC, or 470 to 399 BC. We have the Buddha, older than that, slightly more ancient, 563 to about 480 BC. And we have Confucius in China, 551 to 479 BC. And they appear at the same time, and as I said, they stress the importance of rational thinking, of discourse, of dialogue in arriving at the most basic problems that relate to our existence. While Socrates essentially thought that the life of the mind is the most important, in Buddhist philosophy, we have all creatures essentially come from a single cosmic entity, and rebirth is the crucial aspect of Buddhism. This is the aspect of Buddhism that attracted me most to Buddhism, and it links, I think, Buddhist philosophy with modern science, connecting life on Earth with the much bigger system of life that pervades the entire universe. The roots of science and mathematics, as we know it today, are surely not in the West. They are not part of Western or European culture. They go back a very much longer time to ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia and in the Indus Valley, more than 3,000 years ago. The discovery of our number system, of our counting system, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, the numerals that we use, they go back over 3,000 years to ancient India. And also very important in the number system is the Indian invention of zero. That was an concept that arose in India and is generally accepted as such. We owe the concept of infinity, which is also important in mathematics, to Buddhism. We owe the invention of the calculus. We think that the calculus was invented by Newton and Leibniz in Europe in the Middle Ages. Not true at all. The invention of calculus in the last 3 or 4 years has been traced back to Babylonian clay tablets some 4,000 years before the Christian era. Early astronomical observations of the planets moving around the sun, the zodiac, and so on, can be traced back to Indian astronomers as far back as in Vedic times. So the conclusion is that the beginnings of much of what we regard as the foundations of modern science began a long time before the so-called Renaissance in Europe, the so-called Enlightenment in Europe, and they began also very far away from Europe, in India and in China. So this is the background that I want to now expand on. After Europe began to rule the world by force of sea power and gun power and firepower, culture and cultural imperialism began to essentially impede the progress of science, and it continues to play a very crippling role. One example is, as I pointed out briefly earlier, is the number system. Before Europe adopted the Hindu-Arabic number system, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, they had a very cumbersome Roman numerals system that had 1, I, we, and so on. I think you're all familiar with that. And this was going on right through the Roman Empire. When the Indo-Arabic Roman, the number system was introduced to the West, they resisted it very violently. It was regarded as a foreign number system. It was rejected until the late 16th century. And the rejection was purely for reasons of cultural superiority. Europe was just superior to the East. The Indians were seen to be backward and primitive, only fit to be servants of their imperial masters. So this was the reason why the number system was delayed in its acceptance for such a long time, and it impeded the progress of mathematics. After the ancient Greek texts, the works of ancient Greek philosophers, came to be translated first into Arabic and later into Latin. The process began in the 8th century. Europe began to emerge very slowly from the dark ages that it had plunged into for centuries. Greek philosophy, the ideas of Plato, Socrates, and Democritus. Democritus is an important philosopher because he said that we are all made of atoms, that there's no need for creation or God, that we are all made of atoms. And these ideas filtered into the newly Christianized Europe in the early 13th, 14th centuries. Attempts to reconcile Christian theology, the idea that God created everything, that God is the sole purpose of that, God is the creator of the whole universe and so on, to reconcile that with rational philosophy that originally came from Greece, was often full of problems, fraught with problems. And as I will argue later, these problems still hamper the progress of science in certain key areas that I'm going to discuss. The type of science that advanced most rapidly and flourished in the West were those types that allowed humans, and I should say humans in those days were regarded as being the white people, they allowed these humans to exploit the natural world for their benefit. And this was done often at the expense of damaging the environment. They had no respect for the environment, and exploiting slave labor from the colonies. In England in 1600, the East India Company was started, and an era of colonization and exploitation began. British rule in India, all of us know a lot about it, was from 1857 to 1947, when India was ruled essentially, effectively by Queen Victoria. Before that, even earlier, from 1600, the East India Company had a very similar involvement of controlling the economy and the life of India. Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, was a British crown colony from 1796 to 1948. So that is the backdrop, but I want to now discuss the progress from there. In the long history of humanity, the past 100 years stand out as a shining beacon of technological achievement, though not necessarily of scientific enlightenment, I should say, when it comes to matters of the greatest importance. At the start of this century, 100 years ago, our grandparents and great-grandparents were just getting used to the benefits of the steam engine, the motor car, electric lights, the telegraph, and the telephone. This picture here would have been a familiar Colombo scene to my grandparents and parents and perhaps all of your ancestors as well. 100 years, turn the clock back 100 years forward to 2021, we live in a world that our grandparents could not have even dreamt of. The world of laptops and iPhones and instant communication. The world is instantly connected in ways that could never have been imagined 100 years ago. These are pictures, and that's a picture of the seacoast from the Golface Hotel. I think that's one of the new hotels that is coming up right in the middle of that picture. Another 50 years, not even 100 years, roll forward 50 years on, and our children and our grandchildren will surely see an even vaster change in the scene in Colombo and in other parts of the world. We would see driverless cars, skyscrapers rising almost to the clouds, perhaps. And if you don't destroy ourselves in a third world war or disastrous man-made climate change, these would be the images that would greet our descendants. So that picture on the left is actually an artist's depiction of what Colombo would be like. And on the right is also an artist's depiction of what the port city development that is happening now would be like when it is completed. So we wouldn't even recognize these familiar scenes in the heart of our capital city in Colombo. 2021, despite all the major technological and scientific advancements of our modern world, the oldest and most important questions in the world remain completely unanswered. Where did we come from? Why are we here? How did life begin? Where do humans fit into this grand scheme of things? And as I already said, these questions were first asked as far back as 10,000 years ago by our cave-dwelling ancestors. A century after the Buddha, 3 centuries before Christ, the Greek philosopher Aristotle set in train a process of inquiry that still continues, unfinished. Aristotle made observations of the world around him and came to many conclusions. Some of these conclusions were right, but some were woefully wrong. Aristotle's mistakes, Aristotle's errors, ran through history and held back Western science for centuries. Among these mistakes are the following: the Earth being at the center of the entire universe, stars and planets just moving around the Earth. This was the Aristotelian view of the universe, the Earth-centered universe. And then, as far as our present discussion is concerned, Aristotle also said that life is centered on the Earth, that life arises continuously from non-living material on the Earth. Dismantling Aristotle's wrong ideas has essentially defined the path of Western science for nearly 2,000 years. Christian theological support for the entire Aristotelian corpus followed after the ascension of St. Thomas Aquinas in the early Middle Ages. After that, the Pope ruled. Papal decrees ruled the world. And thereafter, the most important questions of our existence came to be inextricably linked to theology and religious culture. And this was the start of a huge process that we have had to dismantle and to challenge. Aristotle
It appears the professor has dropped off. Please bear with us. He will be online shortly. Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, Prof. Wickramasinghe, we can hear you now.
Connection went off, isn't it? So share screen again. And, well,
We can see your screen now if you put in presentation mode.
okay, okay. No, I can't open it.
You can't open it.
Wait a minute. Okay. Okay, so Aristotle, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I think you're still okay. Aristotle's errors ran through history, and as I said, held back Western science for centuries. Earth at the center, stars around it, and all. It's totally wrong. And then the other idea of life starting. I went through this as well. Christian theological support for Aristotle's philosophy started with Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, and thereafter the most important questions of our existence came to be linked to theology and religious culture. So we had that before we went off. This is a picture of Aristotle's worldview with the earth at the center on the left and the post-Copernican correct worldview on the right. The other issues that I want to talk about now in the remaining time, I hope I can get some extra time, is that Aristotle's ideas of spontaneous generation, life starting and ending on the earth, as you see on the left-hand side, the column here, is totally wrong. As it turns out through history, it is totally wrong. And the correct view is panspermia, life everywhere, and life delivered across the galaxy in the form of bacteria and viruses. So this is the right view. And so that's the track that I want to follow. Decisive disproof of Aristotle's earth-centered view began with the Copernican revolution in the 15th century, and it was not without casualties that the Copernican revolution was essentially completed. Many casualties were recorded. For instance, Galileo was imprisoned. Bruno, this poor guy Bruno, Giordano Bruno, philosopher, mathematician, poet, was burnt to death for saying that there were inhabited planets orbiting distant stars. And this is, as I said, this is the Buddhist view that we had already seen in the first century, and it was articulated by Giordano Bruno, and for saying that, he was essentially burnt. He was condemned to death. This proof of Aristotle's earth-centered biology started with the French biologist Pasteur some 150 years ago, and this is still unfinished business, unfinished work, and work that I've been involved in over a lifetime. In 1864, Louis Pasteur showed that processes like fermentation of wine and souring of milk did not occur if there were no microbes. That microbes are responsible for these processes. And he made the very famous statement that life always comes from life. What Pasteur did was to effectively challenge Aristotelian spontaneous generation and so reopen an even older idea. And this is the idea that Venerable Sylvia has told you that I was involved in for a long lifetime. This is idea known as panspermia. Panspermia is a theory that predates Aristotle, and it goes back in the Western world, in Western tradition, to classical Greece, to Anaxagoras, a philosopher called Anaxagoras, who around the 5th century BC proposed that living seeds, which he called spermata, were distributed everywhere throughout the cosmos. But this basic concept has even older roots, and not surprisingly, those older roots go back to India, to Vedic traditions of ancient India that go back thousands of years earlier. Establishing the correctness of panspermia, namely the correctness of our connection with the universe, our intimate, inextricable biological connection with the universe, has been my scientific journey in large part. I would give you a brief outline, despite the disturbance that we had on the connection. I would like to give you a brief outline of the main evidence for my own theory, because this is a worldview that turned out to be consistent with Buddhism and vitally, and as I shall indicate to you, it's a worldview that is vitally important for our future survival. So my research career, my endeavor to understand the world started with trying to find out what these dark patches in the Milky Way are really made of. And that process had been happening already before I arrived at Cambridge in 1960. It had been happening for a good half a century. In 1940, astronomers had thought that these dark patches between the distribution of stars were really gaps really holes in the distribution of stars. In 1950, astronomers decided that they were caused by the absorption of light from the background stars by trillions and trillions of dust particles. So these were dark clouds that were placed in front of the stars, and so you see black patches instead of stars. In 1955, astronomers had made up their mind that the dust was made of microscopic dust ice crystals, like water ice crystals, similar to the crystals of ice that exist in the Earth's clouds. If you look up in the clouds, you see these cumulus clouds, and the white of the cumulus clouds is due to these ice crystals. In 1960, I came along, and my study showed, on a very short time scale, in a matter of months, I was able to show that these dust particles are not made of ice, but they were made largely of the element carbon. And of course, astronomers immediately fought against this, but eventually they had to agree. They had to agree that the dust had the most important component in the form of the element carbon. From carbon dust, we progressed by studying more and more astronomical data, and so on. We studied this material, and then we came to the conclusion that carbon dust had not to be just inorganic carbon, but eventually had to be living particles. Fred and I, in 1982, in fact, proposed a theory of cometary panspermia, which says that life is a cosmic phenomenon, that the genetic components of life are essentially moved around the universe by comets, and comets hitting the Earth brought life to the Earth. And this idea was discussed by us for several years before there was a meeting that we held in Sri Lanka in 1982, commemorating the Institute of Fundamental Studies, the inauguration of the Institute of Fundamental Studies. And we, as a result of the conference, we published this document as a memoir of the IFS, now called the NIFS, Proofs that Life is Cosmic. So that was the beginning of our story. In 2019, evidence for life everywhere, being bacteria, turned out to be very, very strong. Comets had life processes taking place, evidence for life, and these comets carrying life essentially extended even to the most distant parts of the universe. So comets throw out bacteria is the idea, is the theory, and it's these particles that populate all these dark clouds in the Milky Way. These are the genetic building blocks of life. These dust particles, viruses, we think, contain the genetic building blocks of life, and they are essentially like children's jigsaw pieces ready for assembly into a whole range of life forms on any planet on which they could fall. So it's all that is required is that these building blocks are transported by comets, and they are assembled over long periods of time into the grand panorama of life that we find today on the Earth. So comets' impacts almost certainly brought new genes, is the idea, is a theory that is gaining a lot of evidence. And it gave rise, among other things, to a huge explosion of life forms about 500 million years ago. And it's from that explosion, it had a comet impact was involved there. And from that time, higher life forms emerged on the Earth. Neo-Darwinian evolution is just regarded as being a minor process, a fine-tuning of this entire business. So from 1980 to 2021 to the present day, a vast cascade of evidence have all pointed to life being a cosmic phenomenon. Evidence has come from almost every direction. And the question, this is a range of some of the books that I published, and in addition to that, there were over 450 journal papers and some 60 in the journal Nature. And the question that one has to ask is why, in spite of all this evidence that has been presented to the scientific world, is a major paradigm shift from Earth-centered life to cosmic-centered life not being achieved, and this not being conceded. I think the answer to that I would come to right at the end. But the question that I really next want to ask is, how can we test this theory and prove it once and for all to the conviction of everybody? Firstly, we must look for evidence here and now, right here on the Earth, that bacteria and viruses are coming in from space. We must look for evidence of cosmic viruses and bacteria that might be interacting with species, with ourselves, with animals and plants. And we must look for footprints of ancient viruses, cosmic viruses that came a long time ago and have become essentially part of our genomes. Look for evidence of space-borne viruses that contribute to pandemics. So we know as a fact that the Earth mops up material from comets. This is a picture of a meteors. If you look at the night sky, often you see meteors coming in. And these are little clumps of cometary particles coming in. Most of it is burnt by the heat of entry, but the speed of entry. But not all of it burns as meteors. So the question that we asked way back in 2000, or 1999, in fact, was how can this be tested? How can we show to everybody's conviction, to convince everybody that this is happening here and now? In collaboration with the Indian Space Research Organization, a group of us, myself, Fred Hall, a group of Indian scientists, a group of UK scientists, set out to collect the material that is falling in on a daily basis from comets and collect it before it became mixed up with the Earth's contamination, before it came to the surface. So what we did was to send these collecting devices. These were these tubes, empty vacuum tubes, sterilized vacuum tubes that were cooled and sent to 50 kilometers. The seals were opened when it went to above the stratosphere, opened, and then all the air rushed in and filled these tubes, and the tubes were then parachuted back to the Earth. And in 2001, this is what the tubes look like. Air from 41 kilometers in the stratosphere was found to contain a great abundance of bacteria that could not have come from the ground. And we here have a clump of cocci, a rod-shaped bacterium, and a bacillus, and a spherical bacteria, and viable and non-cultivable bacteria as well. And we estimate that something like 200 tons of this material arrive at the Earth every single day. A similar experiment in 2021 is being planned currently, right here and now, at the National Institute of Fundamental Studies in Sri Lanka. But the most compelling evidence up to the present time for continuing input of microorganisms came in 2008, only 3 years ago, with the announcement that microorganisms were discovered, bacteria were discovered, on the outside surface of the International Space Station. Now, the International Space Station orbits at a height of 400 kilometers. And so there's no chance that anything that was found on the outside, right here, of the space station could have been carried from the ground. And this has been confirmed several times. What more evidence do we need, I ask scientists, and they have no answer. Similarly, quite recently, an independent study closer to the ground, a group of scientists took equipment to the highest mountaintop in Europe and picked the stuff that is falling in the mist and the rain from what is called the atmospheric boundary layer. And they discovered that something like 1 billion virus particles, 1 billion, 10 to the 9 virus particles are falling on the Earth, on every square meter of the Earth. So take 1 square meter of the Earth on a single day, 1 billion virus particles are falling. And so the reaction, of course, is to say that most of this must have been lifted from the ground and just brought back down with the mist. Some of it would have been, there's no doubt about it, but a fraction, even 1%, has to be of space origin. And it is of absolute importance for our future, even for our survival and for our safety, to find out what that small fraction is. And that has not been done. But there is more to come. Viruses can cause disease, and we all know that. But more importantly, they can transmit and they can carry genes, genetic material between species on the Earth. This is known as a fact, that genes, viruses should transport genes from plants to animals, from insects to other animals, and even to humans. And so by extrapolation of that process, a well-defined process, they could certainly carry information, genetic information, across the cosmos. And we have for 30 years now argued quite persuasively that cometary viruses are the drivers of evolution. If not for viruses, we would not have advanced to the state that we are. Humans would not have emerged. So next what happens is that Fred and I argued that the evolution of higher life forms, emergence of intelligence, also could be crucially dependent on this input of cometary viruses. So we have a cosmic cloud of viruses coming from comets, containing all the genetic programs of life. All life on Earth evolves, develops in symbiosis with cometary viruses. Any species, any life form that develops total immunity from this process, from being affected from viruses, will cease to evolve and therefore will become extinct. Support for this thesis has come from the relatively new science of genome sequencing. In the year 2001, we all know that the human genome came to be fully sequenced. And after that, the DNA of all other creatures were also sequenced, including fossil genes that are present in fossils. So sequencing of the human genome reveals some very amazing things. This is the pie chart of the human genome, and I don't want to go into detail because we are already, with all the delays that happened, we are already running over time. I want just to mention that over 5% of the human genome is made up of relic viruses. And these relic viruses came unquestionably from past pandemics that affected our ancestors, our pre-human ancestors. Remember I told you about the evolution of hominids, humans from our monkey ancestors, and this evolution over 1 million years was marked by, apparently, definitely by a succession of pandemics that were, each of these were a near close call to total extinction of the line. We could easily have stopped this in the process. But what happened was that at every stage of every major pandemic, a new bit of information was added to the evolving line. And then you eventually arrive at humans. And I put a picture of my colleague, Fred Hoyle, as epitomizing the intelligent human. Anyway, that's the sequence that we have in medical science and biology, the vital importance of a microbiome, a cloud of bacteria and viruses that are linked to each one of us, is only just coming to be recognized. We all know about the microbiome. Most of us know about the microbiome. Bacterial cells in our body, within our body, outnumber human cells and by a huge factor, and they are an important contribution to the functioning of our cells for our lives. We know that there's a microbiome in our digestive system. There's a microbiome even in our brains. And that is now being recognized. There is growing evidence that viruses are responsible for the emergence of human consciousness. And this is only a paper that emerged, that was published about 3 years ago. An ancient virus may be responsible for human consciousness, is the conclusion of that study. The brain, gut, and consciousness microbiology of our mind. From other studies, it is becoming amply clear that our consciousness has a direct connection with the viral cloud, with the microbiome that is connected with us. And this essentially is a Buddhist point of view. And the Buddhist point of view, as was explained to me by the Venerable Narada Mahathera, is the following, that a human being, an intelligent human being, with this microbiome of consciousness is essentially the result of a sperm and an egg coming together with a packet of consciousness. And this is the packet of consciousness that is the microbiome, associated with the microbiome, and that leads to a conscious, sentient being, being that can be reborn, and so on in the Buddhist way. Poet Wordsworth expressed a very similar sentiment as to how what he called a favored being is made through an infant fetus, essentially communing, linking with the clouds, as he called it, in his poem, The Prelude. And he essentially said that, this is what I say, what he wrote, I believe that nature oftentimes, and so on, all that. So let me just rush through this because I'm going over time. So I'm almost at the end now. Ancient viruses have also been discovered in the last months, in fact, this is 2021, been discovered in ancient glaciers and permafrost, and could even be released in viable form with global warming if it happens in the future. Strongest evidence for an ongoing space incidence of viruses is of a pathogen that might cause diseases. And this is perhaps also true of COVID-19. I don't want to expand on that because it's a very emotive issue, the present pandemic. And this has been regarded as being a distinct possibility from the end of the 19th century. In relation to influenza, there was a pandemic of 1919, and we've written a lot about it. There's a statement here by a doctor called Louis Weinstein, who reviewed all the data and found out that person-to-person spread occurred in local regions, but the disease could not have appeared in widely separated parts of the world if not for some space incidences. For example, he notes that in Boston and Bombay, a new pandemic starts on the same day. And of course, Boston and Bombay are so far removed and so far away from each other that in 1919, without any air travel, there could not have been people connecting, or there could have been person-to-person contact. So the summary of the process of a cometary virus causing a disease is that it enters the stratosphere, it comes down with the weather, with the winter downdrafts, it goes into the troposphere, raindrops condense around it, then it reaches ground level atmosphere, and then it reaches the human respiratory tract and it comes down to the earth. This is a paper that we wrote about a couple of months ago. The world should establish an early warning system for viral infections by space monitoring, and it's by a leading epidemiologist in China and myself. Of course, and it appeared in a very prominent journal, but no one has taken any notice of it. And to wrap up, many different lines of evidence converge on life being cosmic. The nature of cosmic dust, the properties of cosmic dust, properties of geology, I didn't have time to go into it, genetics, meteorites, comets, and the story of diseases. They all converge on this single and simple hypothesis: life is cosmic. No wrong theory, I would argue, in the entire history of science has so many prior predictions that have been unfailingly verified in subsequent experiments. So there's an alarming trend to devalue or to ignore this vast body of evidence, and one has to ask why. I think it is because it is reckoned to be culturally inadmissible, and it has the result or the possible aim of delaying the acceptance is to try to extend the ailing geocentric paradigm, the Aristotelian paradigm of life being centered on the earth. This regrettable attitude poses an imminent danger, not just for science, but for the well-being of humanity as a whole. I think there's no question that the dawn of a new paradigm where life is centered on, not on the earth, but in this universal phenomenon, has to be reckoned with. A new worldview has to emerge that is consistent with it. And this is bound to happen in the not too distant future, I hope. Whilst ignoring the evidence and arguments that myself and colleagues have relentlessly and tirelessly amassed and presented over 40 years in books and television interviews and so on, it seems okay now to take over our vast corpus of work without the slightest reference or credit to it. And this is what seems to have happened in the last weeks. A certain Paul Davies has published a book, I think. It is say viruses may exist everywhere in the universe. We might be derived from viruses. COVID epidemic might come from space and all that. And it's been attributed to a certain Paul Davies. But so this is the truth of the matter. It is being conceded. It's been seen as serious, but our priority, or 40 years' priority, is being ignored. The wrong paradigm of science leads to unabated hatreds, and I think unless the Buddhist worldview is adopted, disaster looms ahead for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. So this is a picture that shows the proliferation of nuclear weapons from the period 1964 to 2017, 2020s here. It's going up steeply, almost exponentially. Every country thinks that they have to amass a nuclear arsenal. There is enough nuclear material in the world, in the arsenals of the world, essentially to destroy the whole planet. And there's also an alarming escalation of biological weapon accumulation. There are many centers around the world that is devising biological weapons, seeking to destroy people, destroy communities using bacteria and viruses that are genetically engineered. So all this is happening. And I want to conclude by saying that my life's work in science shows not only the connectedness of all life in the universe, but also the connectedness, the sublimity, and the fragility of life on our planet. The Buddha taught us that of the oneness of all life. He exhorted his monks not to cut down trees, not to disturb the exquisite balance of life that exists in the world. And one of his statements is this quotation: "He who has understanding and great wisdom does not think of harming himself, nor any living creature, nor harming both alike. He rather thinks of his own welfare, of that of others, of that of both, and of the welfare of the whole world. In that way, one shows understanding and great wisdom." And in conclusion, I can do no better than to quote from a verse in the Dhammapada from Pali that my early teacher of Buddhism, the Venerable Narada, translated into this really elegant English translation. "Hatreds never cease by hatreds in this world. Through love alone they cease. This is the eternal truth." And this is the Venerable Narada receiving a presentation from His Excellency the President, and that is me presenting a book to the same President Jabodhan in 1982. And so this is my connection with with both President Jabodh and with Venerable Narada. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that very interesting speech. We can take a couple of questions given the limited time we have. Please put your hand up and I can take you off mute to ask the question. Thank you. Alternatively, you can also type your question in the chat box.
This seems good.
Please ask your question, Graham.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
It's Graham here.
Graham, hi Graham. You heard it
It was wonderful.
across the United States. That's great. Yeah. Unfortunately, there was a hitch in the communication, and I didn't do as well as I thought I might have. But
It was fantastic. It was really wonderful, and thank you for sharing this fantastic talk. And thank you to the Buddhist Society for enabling this. I just had a question, more of an observation, really. This is a quote from the preface of your book. This quest for discovery can sometimes turn back on itself, and rather than unearth any truths, it merely reveals its own process. And here, ultimate reality poses to be ever elusive. At such times, science and mathematics, with their pretenses to objectivity, can seem less able than music, poetry, or art to explain our existence. The arts being able to offer an experience of the mystery without a self-conscious focus on absolute truths. That's from Where Did We Come From?
well, I stand by that, because I think the science that I discussed or described in my lecture, some of it is definite. I mean, there are statements of science that are irrefutable, like the Earth being not the center of the universe and so on. All that has been proven to be absolute fact. But there are other areas of science, and these areas refer to subjects like consciousness. We forget the idea of what consciousness is in terms of science. And it is possible that through music, through poetry, through meditation, through religious inquiry, we would get a much deeper understanding of these most mysterious aspects of our condition, of our human condition. So that was the reason for my statement. I think poets and musicians essentially have grasped something that is basically unquantifiable, but is essentially reachable through our conscious minds.
And I think that for me was, in a way, my question leading to this, that I feel like in a spiritualist sense, we are in a time now where more and more people are open to this idea of purely through faith or purely through spiritual practice that we can not only understand but believe the science that you are presenting, purely through faith and purely through spiritual practice.
I think you don't have to really struggle very hard to accept the merit of the idea that we are not alone in the universe, that life is fairly trivial, individual life is fairly trivial, and therefore the connectedness of all life is almost accepted fact. We should accept it. And this is, I think, the sense of Buddhism, that all life is connected. This is the main tenet of Buddhism, is that there is a cycle of rebirth and karma and so on, and those are linked to irrefutable observations of the world around us. We do things and there's a result. Action has a consequence, and so that is karma in a more practical, pragmatic way. So that is my take on it. That the connectivity of all life in the universe has to be taken for granted. But the cultural constraints are still really enormous. We have a situation where, I hate to say this to a wide audience, but Judeo-Christian culture, for all its merits, of course, there are lots of merits in it, is a constraint in our understanding of ourselves, in essentially ensuring the continuity of our species, because it is that selfishness that leads to what we are today, having to deal with climate change, global war, atomic wars, biological war, and so on.
Thank you. I think we have one question that's come in through the chat.
Okay.
It's saying, where is the mind?
The mind is like the brain is like, I think, a radio receiver. That's my image of the mind. It's a physical object like a radio set, and it is receiving information from the external universe. And the mind is essentially a collection of maybe in the form of bacteria, viruses, who knows? But it is extrinsic to the brain itself, to the physical structure of the brain.
Thank you, Professor.
I don't know if it answers it, but I think it actually, the answer is I mean, nobody knows the connection in a scientific sense to formulate it, but I think if we are involved in meditation, if you're involved in thinking deep thoughts about religion, about ourselves, and about the nature of life, rebirth, and so on, I think these all are bits of information that come in from the external universe into our receiver, which is the brain.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that's all we have time for today for questions. I would hand over to Venerable Sila Vimala to do the thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'm very grateful for more than nearly 1.5 hours. You have shared your wonderful understanding about the universe and science with the audience. Actually, it is an honor to our great founder, Anagarika Dhammapala, not only to great honor to our founder, actually it is an honor to the community, Buddhist community, and to the London Buddhist Vihara. Actually, the talk, your speech was mind-blowing, highlighting the Buddha's teaching from ancient Pali scriptures. You have compared modern scientific discoveries about the universe with the Buddha's teaching. It is nearly 3 millennia ago the Buddha has given these teachings. You are in the 21st century, one of the great scientists have compared the teaching with the science. It is very seeing all these beautiful sites as artifacts it was jaw-dropping actually. You have given such a great thought-provoking speech today. We are very, very grateful to you, sir, for this wonderful speech. Last nearly 2 years, we have been under the threat of pandemic. The whole entire world. No any speaker had been invited during this period. So therefore, this speech actually given good inspiration to all of us as we are under the due to this pandemic fear, a lot of fear and anxiety we have. So this speech actually gave good inspiration to us today. So we are very, again, I must thank you, sir, on Sri Lanka. We are very proud about you. We are very proud as Sri Lankans, as we are proud about our founder, Garka Dhamapala, as he was a son of our mother country, and also as you are son of mother Sri Lanka. We are very proud about you. We would like to extend our blessings of the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha to you, wishing you good health and also protection from all the dangers and the current situation. We wish you good health to continue a great service for the humanity many more years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Venerable Sri Vimla. It is a pleasure to be with you, even virtually, and I'm only sorry that there were glitches in the technology, and I hope that would be overlooked.
Yeah.
Recording stopped.